That is absurd. What? I'm gonna cry now. He may have smacked me.
They were the voices that melted hearts, the faces the world couldn't look away from. But behind the applause, behind the flashing lights, there were secrets, deals no contract could ever capture, choices made not for glory, but for survival. Tonight, we peel back the curtain, and once you step inside, you might never hear these icons the same way again. Marvin Gaye, the Prince of Motown, the man whose voice could melt steel and mend broken hearts. But before the legend, there was the struggle. When Marvin first hit Los Angeles in the late 60s, he wasn't a star. He was broke, alone, carrying more dreams than dollars. AA didn't care. It chewed up newcomers for breakfast. Didn't matter that Marvin had sung with Motown. Didn't matter that he had the voice of an angel. Rent still had to be paid, and that's when the whispers begin. People close to him claimed Marvin accepted invitations, not to recording studios, not to label offices, but to penthouses, luxurious rooms owned by people with money to spend and secrets to keep. He'd arrive in a worn suit, the smell of cigarettes and rehearsal sweat still clinging to him. Not a superstar, just a young man trying to survive another week. One bandmate later said, bluntly, he had these strange appointments with older fans. They paid to be near him. These weren't dates, they were transactions. Every smile, every touch. Priced. And that contradiction became Marvin's private torment. On stage, he was a god, a master of love songs. Women fainted when he sang. Crowds believed he had everything. But in reality, he was fighting to keep the lights on, singing about free love, while living in a world where intimacy came with a bill. And here's the haunting part. When you listen to Marvin today, really listen. You hear more than just romance. Let's get it on. Sexual healing. Fans thought it was about pleasure, but those closest to him, they say it was also a cry, a sigh from a man who once had to sell the very thing he sang about. Did he ever admit it? No. Maybe because he knew the truth would be twisted. Maybe because fame taught him silence was safer. But witnesses remembered. Marvin sitting alone with a drink. Phone ringing, then leaving, as if the call itself was another performance he had no choice but to give. That's the tragedy. The man who taught the world how to love had to learn how to turn love into currency. Even after he made it big, the shadows never left him. They lived in his eyes, in the weight of his voice, in the way he stretched every note, as if bleeding out something only he understood. Marvin Gaye became immortal, but behind the immortality was a man torn between two worlds, the light of fame and the darkness of survival, and that contradiction is what makes his music hit harder than almost anyone else's. Rick James, the king of funk, the wild spirit who gave us Super Freak. Bold, flashy, outrageous, but that's the Rick James of the 80s, the man in neon leather, the icon who strutted across stages like he owned the planet. Before that, he was just another hungry newcomer, a kid trying to break into the music world, and Los Angeles didn't greet him with open arms. It tested him. Hard, so how did Rick survive? He played a game most people never admit exists. Picture it. Beverly Hills mansions, liquor flowing, smoke filling the air, music pulsing until dawn, and in the middle of it all, Rick James, not yet a superstar, not yet untouchable, just a young man with a guitar, a wicked smile, and a need to be remembered. At those parties, he wasn't just entertainment, he was temptation. Hosts would pull him aside whispering, "Stay a little longer, and you'll be taken care of." And Rick knew exactly what that meant. For some, that offer would be a shameful secret. But Rick, he flipped it. He took those nights, the chaos, the deals, the blurred lines, and turned them into his brand. Every wild stage move, born from the nights when he had to give people what they paid for. Every outrageous lyric, echoes of things he once said in smoke-filled rooms when no one but the rich were listening. A fellow musician remembered one dawn clearly. Rick walked out of a mansion, shirt half open, pocket stuffed with cash, eyes bloodshot but alive, and whistling a brand new melody. That's how Rick worked. He never wasted an experience. He fed off it, turned it into funk, turned it into fire, and when fame finally came, he didn't hide his past. In an interview, when pressed about those early years, Rick just laughed. "If you're in the game, play the game," he said. "I played it better than most." That wasn't arrogance. It was survival. Rick James wasn't ashamed of how he climbed the ladder. He wore it like armor. The reason he could walk on stage half naked, screaming into the mic, daring the world to look away, is because he had already stared down judgment in private rooms. His genius was in turning shame into swagger, his secret nights into anthems, and his scars into the kind of energy that made crowds feel alive. That's why even today, when you hear "Give It To Me Baby" or "Super Freak," you don't just hear a song, you hear the roar of a man who survived the shadows and then made the shadows dance. Teddy Pendergrass, the man with the velvet baritone, the voice that could stop a heartbeat. By the late 70s, he was an R&B sex symbol, women screaming his name, lining up for his famous women-only concerts. But that was the legend. Before the spotlight, the story looked very different. Teddy started not at center stage, but behind it, just a drummer, sweating in the background with Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, keeping time while someone else took the applause. But offstage, there were whispers, stories. Industry insiders never wrote in biographies, rumors that Teddy didn't just play drums, he played survival. People close to those days said Teddy knew how to please VIP clients. Sounds like a compliment, but insiders knew it meant more. He was tall, smooth, confident in a way most young men weren't, and in Philadelphia, word spread that certain wealthy patrons noticed. Invitations followed, private dinners, quiet evenings, and envelopes that kept him afloat when the music didn't. Were they just rumors? Maybe, but they matched the image Teddy carried when he finally stepped into the spotlight. Because when Teddy sang, it didn't sound like fantasy. It sounded like experience. Every lyric, every whisper, every low growl. It was too real, too lived in, for people not to wonder. Had Teddy already lived the songs before he ever recorded them? Fans said Teddy didn't just sing to women. He sang like he was already in the room with them, like the lights were low, like the night was private. That was the magic, and maybe that magic was born in the quiet deals of his early days. But here's what makes Teddy's story cut deeper. He never denied, he never confirmed. He simply carried the aura of a man who had been places most wouldn't admit, and instead of shame, he turned that aura into allure. By the time he became a solo star, women threw themselves at him. Promoters billed him as the ultimate seducer. And the rumors? They didn't hurt him. They amplified him. They made the legend bigger because audiences believed every note. They believed Teddy knew the price of intimacy. They believed Teddy's love songs were confessions. And maybe, in a way, they were. The tragedy of Teddy Pendergrass is often told through the accident that ended his career on stage. But the hidden prelude, the quiet exchanges, the whispered nights, the survival deals, those shaped the man just as much. That's why his music doesn't just sound smooth. It sounds lived. It sounds dangerous. It sounds like someone who learned, long before fame, that desire itself can be a currency. Teddy Pendergrass didn't just sing about love, He sang about survival dressed as seduction, and that's why his voice still pulls listeners into the dark, private corners of his world. Luther Vandross, the velvet voice of the 80s, a man who made love songs sound like silk wrapped in gold. To the world, he was elegance, class, perfection. But behind that perfection was a silence so deep it created legends. See, Luther wasn't like Rick James, flaunting his wildness. He wasn't like Teddy, dripping seduction in public. No, Luther was private, almost too private. No scandals, no public romances, no tabloid explosions, nothing. And that blank space, it drove curiosity to a fever pitch. Inside the industry, whispers floated like smoke. They didn't talk about girlfriends. They didn't talk about wild nights. They talked about arrangements. That's the word people used. Polite, vague, but loaded. Arrangements with powerful men, wealthy producers, industry gatekeepers. Deals that didn't happen in recording studios, but in private dining rooms and hidden parties. One tour technician remembered it vividly. Luther never showed up sloppy. He never arrived late. He always looked like he was going on stage, even if it was just a private dinner, and the magic was, he made whoever he was with feel like the most important person in the room. That was Luther's gift. The same charm that melted arenas could turn a private evening into an unforgettable experience. But here's the thing. Luther never spoke about it. Not once. He guarded his personal life like it was a vault. No one knew who he dated. No one knew who he loved. No one knew if the whispers were truth or just fantasy filling the silence. And that silence became a canvas. Fans painted their own stories on it. Critics too. One critic once wrote, "Luther sings about love like a man who knows love is a private contract, not a public declaration." They didn't name the rumors. They didn't have to. The music carried the weight. Listen to A House Is Not a Home. It's tender, yes, but also lonely. Yearning as if Luther was singing about a love he could never fully claim. Listen to Never Too Much. It's joyful on the surface, but underneath, there's an ache, like someone overcompensating for what they can't say out loud. That's the haunting part. Luther's silence spoke louder than words. His songs became his confessions, not with names, not with specifics, but with feelings too heavy to fake. Did the arrangements happen? Were the rumors true? Maybe. Maybe not. But here's what matters. In an era where black artists had to fight for scraps, where opportunity often came at a hidden cost, Luther knew how to play the game without ever exposing his hand. He controlled the music, he controlled the silence, and together, they built an aura of mystery that has never faded. Luther Vandross wasn't just a singer of love songs. He was a master of illusion, a man who gave the world everything through his voice, while giving away almost nothing of himself. And that mystery, that gap between what we know and what we don't, that's what keeps Luther unforgettable, but about love that could never be spoken aloud. Billy Preston, the fifth Beatle, the man whose fingers lit up keyboards on Get Back and Something, a child prodigy who played with gospel legends before he could drive. From the outside, it looked perfect. Blessed. Chosen. But the truth? Billy's road was anything but easy. He was young, talented beyond belief, but also trapped between two worlds. The sacred world of gospel and the wild, unspoken world of survival in Los Angeles. The music industry saw him as useful, but not yet valuable. So while he was backing up stars, he wasn't treated like one. The spotlight wasn't his. Not yet. And in that gap, Billy had to make choices. Rumors swirled around Hollywood that Billy was invited to private gatherings, not the glamorous kind we see in documentaries. The quiet ones, the ones where rich patrons offered more than applause. where music wasn't the only performance expected. A fellow musician once said, "Billy was so young, and they all wanted a piece of him. He didn't always have the power to say no." Imagine that, a teenager with talent beyond comprehension, pulled into adult arrangements he couldn't fully control. Those whispers followed him for decades, that when the gigs didn't pay, when doors closed, wealthy friends kept him afloat. It wasn't a scandal, it was survival, and here's the haunting part. When you listen to Billy Preston's music, you hear that push and pull. Songs like "Will It Go Round in Circles" sound playful, but beneath the groove, there's a question mark, an unease, like a man spinning, trying to laugh off the pain of choices no one should have to make, and nothing from nothing? That wasn't just a catchy line, it was his truth. Nothing in this business came free. Not gigs, not fame, not even love. Billy carried that weight privately. Friends say he battled guilt, secrecy, and the need to keep smiling on stage, because no one wanted to hear about the shadows. They only wanted the joy of his keyboard, yet the shadows leaked out in his voice, in his phrasing, in the melancholy hidden under the funk. Billy Preston's genius was real. His joy was real, but so was the cost. The man who could electrify the Beatles was also the man who, in his early years, had to barter his charm, his company, and maybe even his body, just to keep moving forward. It's uncomfortable, it's tragic, but it's also human. And that duality, childlike joy at the keyboard, adult pain behind closed doors, is what made Billy's music hit so hard, because when you listen closely, you don't just hear a funky jam, you hear a survivor smiling through scars. Bobby Womack, a voice soaked in grit and gospel, a guitar that could cry like it had lived through 100 heartbreaks. By the 70s, he was a soul icon, but his story? It was darker, messier, and more controversial than most fans ever realized. From the start, Bobby was surrounded by giants. Sam Cooke took him under his wing, mentoring him, shaping his sound. Bobby was like a younger brother, part of the family. And then came the scandal. Sam Cooke was murdered in 1964. The world was still grieving when just 3 months later, Bobby married Sam's widow, Barbara. He was only 21. She was 10 years older. The backlash was brutal. Fans called it betrayal. The Cooke family called it unforgivable. And Bobby? He called it love. But the truth was more complicated. Insiders whispered that Barbara wasn't just grieving, she was also looking for security. And Bobby, still young, still broke, suddenly had both a home and a powerful connection in his hands. To some, it looked less like romance and more like an arrangement. But that wasn't the end of the whispers. Behind closed doors, Bobby's life spun into shadows. Drugs, infidelity, even darker secrets. Friends from the era claimed Bobby, like many struggling artists, accepted offers to keep himself afloat. Private nights with wealthy patrons. Situations where saying no wasn't an option if he wanted to survive in the industry. It fit the pattern, because when Bobby sang, there was no innocence in his voice. There was lust, pain, experience. The sound of a man who had lived every temptation and every sin. And maybe that's why fans loved him, because Bobby didn't pretend. He poured the dirt into his music. When he sang, "If you think you're lonely now," you believed he had been through it all. The late nights, the empty bottles, the cold rooms. But his life wasn't just scandal. It was contradiction. He could play a church hymn on guitar with angelic beauty, then step off stage into chaos. He could preach about love in a lyric, then destroy it in real life. And that contradiction is what made Bobby Womack unforgettable. He wasn't polished like Luther. He wasn't flamboyant like Rick. He was raw, unfiltered, wounded. And maybe that wound started in those early years, when survival meant making choices the public never knew about. choices that bled into his music, choices that made his songs sound too real, too lived in to be fiction. Bobby Womack's life was messy, scandalous, tragic. But his voice turned that chaos into art, and that's why, decades later, his songs don't just entertain, they confess. Johnny Gill. Johnny Gill wasn't just another newcomer. When he stepped into the spotlight, replacing Bobby Brown in New Edition, he brought a voice so rich, so smooth, it felt like velvet poured over fire. The group needed him, but almost instantly, the whispers began. Not about his voice, not about his style, but about him. Industry insiders muttered that Johnny wasn't only being groomed musically, he was being groomed socially. Mentorship, they called it. But it didn't always sound like mentorship. Journalists wrote in code, more than just mentorship, one article teased. Enough to spark rumors, not enough to print the full story. Behind the polished image, people claimed Johnny was appearing at private parties, exclusive gatherings with men of wealth and influence, some in music, some far outside it. The kind of events where cameras weren't allowed, where deals were made with a handshake, or just a glance. What was he doing there? Performing, networking, or something more? A fellow musician once said, Johnny always knew how to make an entrance. Sharp suit, perfect smile. You couldn't tell if he was there to sing or to charm. That comment didn't clear the air. It only made the whispers louder. And Johnny, he never chased the rumors. He never issued fiery denials or messy explanations. Instead, he did the most dangerous thing of all. He stayed silent, and that silence gave the whispers power. When Johnny sang ballads like My, fans swore they heard secrets wrapped in every note. The way he stretched a word, the way he held a gaze. It felt less like a performance and more like a confession. Some claimed his voice carried experiences too complex to be invented, that his warmth and intimacy on stage came from long nights the public would never know about. Crew members remembered private events on off nights, never advertised, never photographed, exclusive rooms where Johnny was the highlight, but not for the music charts. Payment was discreet. Presence was priceless. The irony, the general public never had access to any of this. They only saw the suits, the elegance, the perfect gentleman who made every lyric sound like a love letter. But in the background, insiders connected the dots, and whether those dots formed truth or myth didn't matter. The image of Johnny Gill as both star and secret companion became locked into his legacy. Today, fans still debated. Was he just the ultimate professional, keeping elite company to secure his place in a cutthroat industry? Or was there a more private story hidden beneath the smooth baritone? Johnny never answered. Maybe that's why he's still fascinating, because some legends don't need proof. They only need whispers. And Johnny Gill's career is a symphony of them. Billy Paul. Billy Paul never walked onto a stage as an innocent man. Even before the world knew him for Me and Mrs. Jones, his eyes carried a depth, a look that said he'd already lived 10 lives before fame ever touched him. And if you believe the whispers, he had. In Philadelphia, the street spoke of Billy in hushed tones, not just as a singer, but as a man who knew how to keep wealthy company. Ladies of status, women with influence, women who were used to getting exactly what they wanted, and who didn't mind paying for it. A Philly DJ once lowered his voice and said, Billy was kept to sing, but not in a place the public could see. That unfinished sentence says more than a whole book. Picture it, private rooms, dim yellow lights, glasses of red wine sweating on polished tables, and Billy, young, magnetic, his voice like liquid silk, singing not to an audience of thousands, but to one woman who felt like the only person in the universe. Was it performance? Was it intimacy? Or was it both, perfectly tangled together? The truth is blurred, and that blur became Billy's mystique. Then came Me and Mrs. Jones. On the surface, just a song about an affair. But for those who knew the whispers, it sounded like something more. A confession, appointments at the same cafe, meetings that couldn't be public, a love that had to be hidden. Fans asked each other, is this just a story, or is Billy singing about himself? An old friend recalled how, in his early days, Billy would leave a smoky club around midnight. Not heading home, but sliding into the back of a luxury car waiting just for him. The next morning, he'd return with an unreadable smile. No one asked questions. No one needed to. For a struggling black artist in a ruthless industry, survival often meant taking chances others wouldn't dare to. Some artists relied on charm, some on talent. Billy used both, and he turned that duality into an aura that never left him. On stage, he was smooth elegance. Off stage, he was a mystery wrapped in rumor, and he liked it that way. Billy never denied the stories, never tried to explain them away. He simply let them hover, like smoke curling in a darkened room, and that silence made the legend stronger. Because when Billy Paul sang, fans didn't just hear a song, they felt a man who had been there, who had lived through nights of secrecy and desire, a man who understood that sometimes love is not about forever. It's about surviving the moment. That's what made him unforgettable. Today, the rumors remain. No photos, no contracts, nothing on paper, just memories, just whispers. And the haunting perfection of Me and Mrs. Jones, a hit that feels less like a performance and more like a diary set to music. Billy Paul chose to walk that thin line between myth and reality, and that choice made him a legend, because sometimes the story you don't tell becomes the story people can never forget. Fillmore Slim, the bluesman who played the streets. Most artists try to bury their past, hide it, polish it, rewrite it into something safe. Not Fillmore Slim. He walked straight into the spotlight and owned it. The world called him the West Coast pimp godfather. And instead of denying it, Slim smiled wide and said, "Music and the streets were my two loves." That one sentence tells you everything. For Slim, music wasn't a clean escape from the streets. It was another hustle, another way to survive, another way to turn pain into profit. From the streets to the stage. In the 1960s and 70s, San Francisco's Fillmore district was electric. It was a world where blues and soul poured out of smoky bars. But just outside, deals were happening on every corner. Slim didn't just witness this, he lived it. 1 foot in the clubs, 1 foot on the pavement. He would play his guitar in a small joint at midnight, and by 2 a.m., disappear into private back rooms where no contracts were needed. Because Slim's currency wasn't just music. It was presence, charisma, control. The brand of a street legend. Where other artists sanitized their image for record labels, Slim doubled down. Sharp suits, wide-brimmed hats, jewelry that caught the light like a neon sign. On stage, he was a bluesman. Off stage, he was a street king. And he didn't see a contradiction. He blended both lives until you couldn't separate them. When Slim sang about struggle, heartbreak, or temptation, people believed him because they knew he wasn't inventing a story. He was living one. The lessons of the street. Slim once said the streets taught him how to read a crowd, when to be fast, when to slow it down, when silence was more powerful than words. That's why his shows hit different. Audiences didn't just hear music, they felt the rhythm of survival. They felt the energy of a man who had negotiated both applause and danger, often in the same night. From scandal to legacy. What makes Fillmore Slim so unique is that he never tried to outrun his past. Where others ducked questions, Slim turned his history into a brand. He wasn't ashamed. He was authentic. That honesty gave him credibility. Fans believed every note. Other musicians respected him because he refused to play by anyone else's rules. And decades later, his legend still grows. Not just as a bluesman, not just as a hustler, but as a living symbol of an era when survival and music walked hand in hand. The final note. Fillmore. Slim's story isn't neat, it isn't pretty, but that's exactly what makes it unforgettable. He is proof that the road to music immortality doesn't always start in a studio. Sometimes it starts under a flickering streetlight with one hand on a guitar, and the other still tied to the hustle. Slim turned those two worlds into one, and that's why when he sings, you don't just hear the blues, you hear life itself. Rough, raw, and unapologetic. If this journey pulled back the curtain for you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories. And remember, behind every legend is a life far messier and far more human than the spotlight ever shows.